Hi, it's Simon J here. I've been thinking a lot recently about the extent to which fascism is growing in the United States. You may or may not have heard about Cop City. I'm not entirely sure how mainstream this discussion has become in American media, but I found the whole thing really disturbing, so let's talk about it. What is Cop City? This is a planned center to train American police in counterinsurgency style urban assaults. The complex will include a mock city, helicopter landing area, and multiple shooting and explosive ranges for police to practice their operations, and we will get into what people expect these to be soon. And it will be built on a 381-acre site on vital forests near Atlanta. I've personally had a really hard time visualizing areas like this in the past, so I went out and had a look for a visual comparison. The best I could find was Disneyland, which is 160 acres. So you can see what that looks like from the air. So when completed, this Cop City training facility will be basically 2 1/3 the size times the size of this. And you can see what Cop City looks like in this image. They are claiming that some parts of this facility will be green space, but we shouldn't take their word that those apparently reserved areas will not be part of the eventual facilities. Even if we take their word that only 85 acres of this area will be used to build training facilities, that would end up being half the size of the Disneyland facilities. Enough land to train a massive urban assault force and to plan out large-scale assaults on any pro-people movements which may emerge in US America. There are a lot of angles to oppose this development from. There is a huge environmental concern, especially because this forest area where this is planned is vital to protect Atlanta from incoming floods and hurricanes. It is also built upon sacred land which belonged to the Muskogee people before their forced removal in 1821 as part of US America's genocidal establishment, expansion, and ethnic cleansing. However, I want to focus on the threat that this further militarization of US America's police poses to any future people's liberation in so-called US America. The construction of Cop City should be seen in light of the anti-police and popular uprisings which have become more common in recent years, especially the Black Lives Matter movement, which despite being a largely spontaneous and decentralized movement, and therefore largely unable to threaten power in US America directly, demonstrated that given the right circumstances, there is a mass base for some sort of radical politics in this country. There were a couple of notable trends and events during the Black Lives Matter and Abolish the Police movements that demonstrate the fascist leanings of the US American police. And I'm going to draw largely from an academic article here from Mihir J. Chaudhary and Joseph Richardson Jr. called Violence Against Black Lives Matter Protesters, a Review. First, the reading and summary of this article. First, reading the findings and summary of this article. Recent findings. Data from various sources suggests that police disproportionately target BLM protests for violent intervention. There is also mounting evidence of organized and vigilante right-wing violence targeting BLM protesters. While police frequently use chemical irritants and projectiles, right-wing protesters often use car rammings to bluntly injure protesters. The true scale and nature of injuries affecting BLM protesters remains unknown, though injuries resulting in the need for intensive care, operative intervention, permanent morbidity, and mortality have been reported. State and conservative civilian violence against BLM protesters represents an ongoing threat to the right to organize and publicly dissent. The use of force manifested by police and right-wing groups against BLM protesters resulted in significant injury and mortality. We can see here that the article is going to find that US police departments across the country disproportionately targeted BLM protesters in a violent manner in order to cause enough bodily harm and injury to participants to repress and disperse the protests, particularly with sympathizers redirecting their energy into ineffective liberal strategies, partially due to the risk associated with radical confrontation with authorities. We can also see the early signs of collaboration between police and right-wing militia groups. This was always a key feature of reactionary movements of violent repression, most famously the use of Freikorps by the pre-fascist Weimar Republic and the black shirts in post-World War I Italy to repress left-wing uprisings during the 1920s and late 1910s. But it is a strategy used today, for example, the use of deputized death squad militias in Colombia to terrorize workers and organizers, or the pogroms carried out against Palestinians by Israeli settlers. The purpose of these deputized militias is to go that step further than official police forces are able to. For example, Kyle Rittenhouse had been seen collaborating with Wisconsin police before murdering Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber. These militias also provide a wellspring of proto-fascist ideology, which very often, when fascist movements do take power in a particular country, provide the ideological breeding ground for that country's fascist movement. The German and Italian examples are key here, and the American so-called patriot militia movements should be viewed in the same vein. Not only do these militias collaborate with the US police force, but many of them have significant member overlap with police forces and other repressive arms of the US American state, such as the military and National Guard. Back to the article. It notes that one of the challenges in quantifying the repression of activists by state authorities during the BLM movement is that police departments do not generally collect their own data on police repression against protesters. Therefore, the database of Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, was used as an alternative. This is a project which usually tracks violent events in war zones, but did the same for protests in US America in recent years. What they found was that state repression was 3 times higher at left-wing protests than right-wing protests, despite left-wing events being significantly less violent by the state's own standard, i.e. destruction of private property. Additionally, when police did react with force against left-wing movements, they acted with considerably more violence than they did against the right-wing movements. According to the article, 51% of BLM protests were met with physical force. This included the use of less lethal projectiles like tear gas or rubber bullets, or beating protesters with batons. An additional point they make is, given the media bias present in reporting on BLM events, it is highly likely that the ACLED dataset misses many episodes of state violence against protesters that are sporadic or occur in less urban areas. End quote. So what we can see here is that during the most recent left-wing mass movement, one that in many ways was an evolution from previous mass movements like Occupy Wall Street and the anti-globalization movement before it, the US American police force acted as a violent oppressive mechanism to deliberately injure protesters in order to suppress that movement, to conjure supporters, to convince supporters that it is dangerous to join, etc. And in doing so, they also collaborated with more openly fascist and violent militias and individuals such as the Proud Boys and Kyle Rittenhouse. This is the status quo as of the construction of Cop City. If completed, this training facility would provide US American police with an additional avenue to step up its militarization and train in counter-insurgency style military tactics inside targeted American cities. This would pose an even greater threat to protesters in future movements. Additionally, another aspect of Cop City, which leads me to call it fascist, should be highlighted. There is a 2/3 private, 1/3 state funding model. Corporations including Coca-Cola, Verizon, Target, Norfolk Southern, Waffle House, Truist Bank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America have contributed $60 million worth of funding to Cop City through the Atlanta Police Foundation. This is important when you consider that while this is often obscured by its particular ideological formation, fascism is at its heart, a movement funded by big capitalists in order to use violence and nationalist ideology to protect their ill-gotten rights to private property. It's clear that Coca-Cola and the like see the US American police as a security force designed to protect their private property in the event that it ever becomes threatened. In Coca-Cola's case, this should be especially viewed in light of their well-documented past of using death squads to target trade union leaders in Colombia. In this sense, Cop City meets Benito Mussolini himself's most basic definition of fascism, the melding of private finance and the state. Additionally, I don't think it's a coincidence that a facility designed to train US American cops from all over the country is being placed in Atlanta, which is a city that has historically been one of the centers of the black community in the Deep South. It is a city that is deeply tied to the civil rights era. It has also, in some ways, been a city where black Americans have been able to build political power more effectively than in others, especially in the Deep South. So I see the decision to base a massive police training program in this city in particular as a further act of aggression by the US American state against the black community. I'd actually initially written this sentence as I see it as a declaration of war, but we all know that the US American state has always been an aggressor against the black population. The police force was founded as an institution to enforce the enslavement of black people and to round up runaway slaves. It was this institution of slavery, as well as the theft of native land, that US America was founded on, and obviously this war on black people continued throughout the period of slavery and beyond through Jim Crow, Ronald Reagan, and the current brutal aggression of the still unreformed police force, which sparked the Black Lives Matter and abolished police movements in the first place. Now, one final thing to talk about is how much the US American state is cracking down on these protests, because I think it speaks to the growing intolerance by the US American ruling class for mass movements that target these sort of explicitly oppressive arms of the state, as well as an escalation of their violent tactics. The Stop Cop City protest movement had set up camp in the forests in order to disrupt and protest the development. In early January, the camps were raided by a combination of Atlanta Police, DeKalb County Police, Georgia State Patrol, the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, and the FBI. These forces raided the protesters' encampments, using police violence to clear the forest of people. During this raid, the police killed one member of the movement, a 26-year-old named Manuel Esteban Perez Terran, who went by Tortuguita, meaning little turtle in Spanish. On January 18th, during the raid, the police entered his tent and shot Tortuguita 13 times, killing him, while the Atlanta police lied about the incident, claiming that Tortuguita fired at the officers first. However, while state troopers don't wear body cameras, Atlanta police do, and footage has been recovered of an Atlanta pig asking his state trooper counterpart, "Man, you fucked your own officer up?" And later, they shot their own man, in reference to the so-called friendly fire, where one state officer was apparently shot by his fellow cops during what can only be called an execution of a protester. Apart from the brazen murder and the usual police cover-up, there is a pretty alarming flippancy here, with police basically joking and celebrating just moments after committing this murder. This is in many ways similar to the behaviour of US American and Australian troops during overseas imperial occupations, where soldiers frequently mock and dehumanize the people they are occupying and murdering, as well as the sort of behaviour you would see from, for example, Pinochet's fascist junta military. Before I move on, I am aware that Atlanta and Georgia State Police dismissed this series of events, but I put zero stock into their statements. You should treat anything these organizations say as basically the "we have investigated ourselves and found no wrongdoing" meme. Apart from the brutality of the police response to the protesters in the forest, which is, by the way, the sort of thing that this sort of facility exists to train police to do more efficiently, it is also necessary to talk about the use of quote-unquote domestic terrorism charges against the Stop Cop City movement. So as of early March, there have been around 40 movement members who have been detained by police. 23 of these protesters were arrested at a music festival organised by the Stop Cop City movement, which wasn't even held in the occupied area. These protesters were charged with domestic terrorism. According to an open letter from Human Rights Watch, a group which, side note, should generally be treated with skepticism from the left, but is likely to be more trustworthy on these domestic issues than on international issues, even if they still are liberals. Georgia's definition of domestic terrorism is any unlawful felony intended to disable or destroy critical infrastructure, a state or government facility, with the intent to alter, change, or coerce the policy of the government. This definition is pretty farcical on its own. It makes it pretty clear that the main concern of the Georgian government is the protection of capitalist infrastructure, and that it sees any attempt by the population living in the state to protect itself from these capitalists as an act of terror. The law carries a mandatory minimum of 5 years imprisonment and up to 35 years if the protesters are convicted. According to the letter, many of these protesters would normally be charged with nothing more than trespass. Georgia officials also made a very stupid, very American argument that the protesters should be viewed as illegitimate and even terrorists because some of them come from out of state. Quoting one of the higher up Atlanta pigs here, "None of these people live here. They do not have a vested interest in this property, and we show that time and time again. Why isn't an individual from Los Angeles, California, concerned about a training facility being built in the state of Georgia? And this is why we consider that domestic terrorism," end quote. This is only an argument that makes sense to Americans who seem really invested in this idea that people from other parts of the country or world should take no interest in an issue if it doesn't occur in their made-up sub-national government area. But the training facility in Georgia will be used to train police to target communities across the states and indeed across the world, with reports coming in the facility could be used to train some of the US's most repressive allies, including Israel. Additionally, these laws fit into a national pattern. Again, to read from that Human Rights Watch open letter, according to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, 45 states have considered anti-protest bills and over 20 enacted them. These bills range from broadly redefining riots to granting civil immunity to drivers who hit protesters with cars, to applying counter-terrorism statutes against protest-related activities, as has happened in Georgia, end quote. It's clear that the authorities across US America are targeting protest movements, particularly if they relate to police repression. These protests are ongoing, and I've included the Stop Cop City movement's reading list down below if you want to know more. Anyway, thank you for listening. Please do the usual YouTube things of liking, subscribing, and commenting. You can also find me on Twitter. That's all for now. Bye, and see you next time.